Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me. First of all, how long do I have to?
The meeting's going to last an hour. So if you'd like to speak for around half an hour, and if you've got that much that you'd like to say to us this evening, and then we can have discussion um, between us
Okay.
all after that.
Okay. Well, let's see how it goes. For those who don't know me, my name is Patricia Pino. As Esther already explained, I started off being an engineer, and then I moved on to economics because even though my intentions behind engineering was to actually do something that was useful for the world, I realized that I hit a limit and that the obstacles in my way were about economics and not about engineering. So I switched over and I moved into economics, partly because I encountered what we call modern monetary theory. To give you a bit of background before that, because there is, part of my youth, part of my upbringing that did have a big impact on my perspective around economics and around politics in general. I am an immigrant. I was born in Peru, in South America, and I grew up during what is now regarded as the worst economic crisis Peru has ever had, and it was the time when South American economies had debt crises, and all the economies in South America seem to have them. Peru had by far the worst and the longest lasting debt crisis. And part of the reason that was the case is because alongside the debt crisis, or part of the causes of the debt crisis, was an insurgency by a group by the name of Shining Path, which some of you may be familiar with. Um, uh, the relationship between Shining Path and the left is complicated, but needless to say, there was a lot of violence at the time, and Peru was effectively in a civil war, even though the media played down what was happening, but really at the peak of it, there were about 200 bombings a week. That's not scattered terrorist attacks. There's a full-on civil war, and um, and so as a result of that, we had the debt crisis. We had huge hyperinflation, and I grew up, seeing these things, but not really understanding what I was hearing or connecting the dots between what I was seeing and the newsreels about the economy. So as I come to the UK and I kind of live in that developed economy, I begin to kind of question why is it that Peru faces such things and the UK doesn't. What are the things that can be attributed to? And to my surprise, obviously, here you also have some politicians who love to talk about the UK being under a debt crisis soon, or warning that there's an impending debt crisis in the UK, and usually speaking about the 1970s as an example of what could happen under a Corbyn government or a Labour government or a socialist government in general. And anyway, that is my my background and where my curiosity was sparked. And of course, the 2008 crisis only deepened that curiosity, and that was really the trigger for me to switch over to economics. Um, and it was a conversation I had with a colleague at the time in engineering whose dad was an economist. And we were discussing about the reasons behind the crisis. And he mentioned Bill Mitchell's blog. I don't know if you guys are familiar with him, but he's one of the original modern monetary theorists. And he said that his dad was writing about what this economist was saying. And he was saying to me things like taxes don't fund government spending. And of course, me, thinking I already knew everything there was to know about economics, at least the basics. I said, no, you're absolutely crazy. I dismissed it outright. I didn't look at it for 2 years. And then as in the news, we start hearing about, it was David Cameron 2010 coming in saying, oh, uh, the deficit is too big, the debt is too high, the debt is too high, the debt is too high. And they kept repeating these things. And I kept asking myself, well, how do you know the debt is too high? Well, if it is too high, if there is, an impending doom or something, if the country is about to collapse, then sure, then we need to cut back. But we better make sure then, if we're going to cut welfare for people, these things are important, then we better make sure that the debt is actually too high. You don't want to cut things unnecessarily. So I start asking my well-educated economist friends, uh, how do you know the debt is too high? And nobody could give me a straight answer. Not a single one of them to such a simple question. So I realized that David Cameron had no clue if the debt was too high, that nobody really that spoke on TV had any clue whether the debt was too high, that it was a purely political statement. And they didn't really care if the debt was too high. To them, the debt was always too high, whatever the debt was. And of course, it was an excuse to cut back on these public services. It was about hiding their true motives behind their ideology. So, because I realized my friends weren't very good at economics, and this was the mainstream, I thought, well, maybe my colleague had a point about listening to alternative economics voices. So I started reading Bill Mitchell's blog, and if you've ever read Bill Mitchell's blog, it's an incredibly dense, very heavy piece of, it's not written for beginners. He goes, he speaks in economics lingo, in very difficult terminology, and he said so to me once. He knows that, but I persevered because I really wanted to understand this. And it took me a few months to really, just a few of his words just going around in my head. And then suddenly one night, it just all clicked and it just all made sense. And I realized that I was looking at the whole problem upside down effectively. And I'll explain that to you in a minute. But basically, I couldn't ever see things any other way again. And suddenly things made so much sense. And as soon as I understood how things really worked, then my next reaction was horror, because I realized that a lot of the pain that is being inflicted on people, usually, those of the most vulnerable kind, was completely gratuitous and completely political, and it had no practical reason to be so, other than just sheer cruelty and greed. And so that really was the thing that kind of spurred me into action of trying to disseminate as much of what I had learned. And from then onwards, it's been about, well, from 2010 onwards, it's been quite a ride meeting others who, like myself, found out about these things and really considered this to be of utmost importance for politics in general. And so the basics of MMT, just to go in a nutshell, it says that a state that issues its own currency has little to no debt denominated in a foreign currency, really faces no financial constraints when it spends. So if there is anything that is available for sale in its own currency, it can be purchased by the state. It never has to look if there is money in the piggy bank before it can do it. It just does it. And it can do it because the state basically creates money as it spends. To give you a detail for that, there is the monetary system, the exchequer system that the UK has. It's very, very complicated. But if you simplify it, you see that whenever the state spends money, it all comes out from an account at the Bank of England that is called a consolidated fund. And the consolidated fund, it can be minus infinity. There is no limit to how much minus is. So it's really just a way of recording how much the government is spending. There is no physical constraint or financial constraint on how much it spends. So, and I think a lot of people are quite accepting of that. That is, I find that that's the easiest part of explaining something like MMD to people. The next question is, of course, well, what about inflation? Aren't you printing money? And the first thing to say about that is that printing money, it's a term that is really outdated. by this point, because it's a term that relates to when the UK was under the gold standard or under a fixed exchange rate. You have legitimate money, which is kind of the money that falls within that relationship with gold, that respects that relationship with gold, or that relationship with an external currency. And then you have money that is created beyond that relationship. So what you would call printed money. So it was a way of distinguishing legitimate and illegitimate money in that sense, when there was those kind of fixed relationships in place. We no longer have a gold standard or a fixed exchange rate, and for good reason. And because of that, that printing money is not really applicable anymore. I mean, as I said, if the government creates money every day, every bit of spending that the government does is creating money, then I suppose all spending is printing money in a way. And so when people talk about printing money, they often don't know exactly what they mean in an operational sense. Often they mean QE, they mean exchanging reserves, or the central bank buying bonds for reserves. Exchanging bonds for reserves is printing money. But then when you ask them, so why would that be inflationary? Why would exchanging bond for reserves be inflationary? They find it difficult to explain why in our current state of the monetary system. So that's the first thing. But that being said, there are limits to what the government spends. The point MMT is saying is that those limits are not financial. Those limits have to do with inflation, but inflation is about the relationship between money creation and the available resources in the economy. So if there are resources that are not employed, above all, unemployment, and the state, for example, creates money to employ those people who are currently unemployed, there's very little risk of inflation, because all you do is mobilizing resources. You're not, too much money chasing limited goods. Story doesn't apply, because you're actually creating more resources, increasing the wealth in proportion to increasing the money supply, if you will. So that is the very basics of it. That is what it is. So first of all, that highlights to me that unemployment is completely pointless and irrational. And actually, it highlights to me, although I have to admit, other MMTers wouldn't necessarily present it this way, but this is where I differ a little bit, because I'm actually quite concerned about the political meaning of MMT, say. And this is to say that not all MMTs have the same politics, not all MMTs necessarily support the same policies, but we all agree that any political debate has to be made through this first understanding what the real capacities of government are. It cannot be done, any political debate cannot be done under false pretenses of what the government can actually do. So when the Tories say there is no money for the NHS, that's a lie. And that is a stifling debate, because they're doing that because what they don't really want to say is, we don't believe in the NHS. And they don't want to say that because they know that they wouldn't bring people with them. So to me, that's against democracy. Of course, we can have a debate about whether you believe or not on the NHS, but it cannot be done under false pretenses. So on that note, my interest in MMT is about the political impact of it and what we can do about it. And I realized then that unemployment being completely unnecessary, it's a means to coerce people into badly paid employment, or into facilitating the acquisition of resources by the private sector. So it's like so taxation creates the need for people to work. And this is another part of perhaps I should go a little bit back, because another question that people usually ask when we talk about government spending is, well, if taxes don't fund government spending, if the government creates money every time it spends, then what's the point of taxes? The point of taxes is, in a nutshell, to give value to the currency, or to enforce the currency's value. So it's Warren Mosler another of MMT's founders, he has a story which sounds a bit extreme, but is actually quite illustrative of what actually happens. He usually starts his lectures as bringing his business cards to the room, and he says, I want you all to clean this room, and I'll pay you each a business card. To do that, I'll give you this business card in exchange. And of course, everybody rejects that because they go, why would I care about a business card? And we're not cleaning this room for you. But then he says, oh, by the way, on your way out, there's a man with a gun. He works for me, and he's going to ask you for one of these business cards. And of course, then the story changes. Suddenly, those business cards are worth something, and people are willing to work in exchange for those business cards. So, to me, that illustrates perhaps an unpleasant aspect of what MMT kind of makes transparent, and that is that the currency is enforced through the violence of the state. Its value is enforced through the violence of the state, specifically through the imposition of taxation. So the state imposes a tax. It says, I need you to pay me X much, and then is willing to pay workers or pay for resources by a certain amount. And so those two operations, the act of imposing a tax and then be willing to exchange the currency in a certain relationship to, say, an hour of work, those two things then enforce the value of the currency. Now, what I explained it to you in very, very simple terms, and it might give you the impression that the government is always in complete control of the value of the currency. In a sense, it is, in the sense that whenever the currency changes value, the state has to be willing to change the relationship by which it spends and taxes. But it doesn't mean that there aren't any other political pressures influencing that decision. So that is the main purpose of taxation, is to give the currency value. Of course, it has other purposes. It can be used. Redistribution or distribution is another main role of taxation. It kind of stopping people from unwanted behavior like smoking, or maybe using petrol fuels or other things. And in which case, by the way, if you're using taxation as a deterrent, then the lower the revenues you get for taxation, then that's a successful tax, right? The reason I say that is because people always judge the success of a tax on how much revenue you're getting from it. But actually, in some cases, for example, in smoking, if you're getting really few taxes from smoking, then your tax is being successful because you're stopping people from consuming cigarettes, for example. So it really depends. And other minor roles, but those are the main roles of taxation. Somebody says taxation enables the state to ensure fair distribution of resources. Absolutely, and to specifically stop wealth pooling at the top and accumulating at the top, because that's quite dangerous, not just in a resource distribution sense, but also in a democratic sense. Fighting for equality is a key role for taxation, for reducing inequality. So that is it in a nutshell. And my interest on the left picking this up, and the reason why I do talks like this, and I have no interest in the right knowing this stuff. They are pretty well served by the current state of affairs and the current narratives and the current view of economics as simply equal to a household economics. And I don't think they'd be interested, but also I don't care if they'd be interested. I think they've got it pretty good right now. I don't think they need help. I think we need a narrative that helps us protect public purpose, helps us protect the vulnerable, and really undoes quite a lot of the damage that has been done over the last 3 decades since Thatcher came to power. And of course, if you remember Thatcher, she used to always have this narrative of the state has no money. It's a very famous quote: the state has no money other than the money people earn themselves. Rishi Sunak, when he was prime minister, he repeated a version of that: the state has no money. And I highlight that because it's important that you realize how key that narrative of finite money is to maintaining neoliberalism, to maintaining, to justifying austerity. So what should the left, how should the left use this? There is one pervasive narrative amongst the left that is really, I guess it's quite a traditional narrative, which is that we should, the only way to fight austerity is to first tax. They agree that we need to tax first before spending, so they concede on that point. But of course, they try to divert the attention rather than taking it away from the vulnerable, take it away from the rich. And these may seem like a kind of a way to killing 2 birds with 1 stone, in a sense. You're taking care of inequality and you are providing for ordinary people. However, the fact that it necessitates the left accepting from the onset that the state has a limited budget means that the right, then all that they have to do, you've already conceded half the battle there. And the right, all they have to do is say, well, you won't raise the money that you need with this tax, because it's actually very hard to go after the money of the rich. Or they'll say something like, they'll leave, they're scaremonger that they leave. And they're usually very successful at scaremongering that they'll leave. We argue that it's a better approach to separate both battles, to say we need to provide public services, we need to make sure everybody's employed, and that is a matter of making sure nobody is in precarious employment, that everybody who is working can afford to give a good life to their family and is not in poverty, abolishing poverty altogether, making sure the disabled have the resources they need, and all this. And on the other hand, say, but we also need to make sure that the wealthy are not hoarding resources, that they're not, for example, hoarding property, or that they are not a threat to democracy. And that is just 2 of the practical aspects of inequality that are pretty negative, that I do wish the left highlighted more, as well as the fact that it's just simply inherently unfair. And we have neoliberalism has been characterized by the rise of the rentier. And I do think that the rentier is the main antagonist of our time, whereas before it may have been the industrialists and the capitalists. Well, they are still capitalists, but they're another type of capitalism, and these are mainly concentrated in finance. This is mainly about interest rates and landlords, and we need to make sure that people are not rewarded simply for having money. We need to make sure that money doesn't accumulate in the way, at the top in the way that it is, because that concentrates resources at the top. It impoverishes the bottom, and of course, eventually may cause a financial crisis or collapse, economic collapse. But also, that needs to be supported by the idea that we need to have a job guarantee, and that everybody who is willing and able should be able to have access to a good quality employment, well paid, with a good amount of holidays, much generous than the minimum wage that we're currently facing. So that is, in a summary, my main political motivation behind this. In terms of the NHS, you guys focus particularly on the NHS. Esther touched upon a couple of things earlier, and maybe I'll make a comment on that now. She mentioned that she doesn't like the term modern monetary theory, and she prefers the term tax money for a sovereign economy. Is that
tax and money in a sovereign economy? Yeah, I think that describes it better.
um, you'll find that people have their own preferences with language around MMT. I've explained to you a version. I don't like to beat up around the bush about this idea of money being driven really by coercion and stuff. Some people have an issue with sovereign, the word sovereign, believe it or not. I actually quite like it. I like the word sovereign. Because to me it really means democracy, and it really means about a people's being able to dictate their own future, and that's exactly what we need. We need a stronger say over how money is used, and money is a public good, so it needs to be in democratic hands. So all this kind of push towards independent central banks, and all this neoliberal idea that if you make sure that money creation is, say, as far apart from the government as possible, and inflation is kind of taken out of government's hands, then that is better, that we're better ruled by technocrats effectively. And I do not believe that at all. I think inflation is an inherent part of a policymaker's role, because inflation, the means to tackle inflation are always political. It's always about distribution. There's always winners and losers to inflation. And the media doesn't usually speak about that in those terms, but there is inflation that could actually benefit workers. For example, if workers' wages went up, there are some scenarios where it could benefit workers. There are often scenarios where it doesn't. They call it sellers inflation, where firms increase prices when there are shortages or wars or geopolitical events, for example, in energy. And they've taken advantage. And of course, that becomes another means of extracting more wealth from workers. But inflation is very, very political, and monetary policy. I'm doing, by the way, I'm doing at the moment a PhD on specifically inflation, which is why it's quite an important topic to me. Okay. But my key point in my PhD is that monetary policy is incredibly flawed for many, many reasons. But one of the reasons is that it purports to be apolitical, when it actually is about, the cure is worse than the sickness, in a sense, because they are trying to adjust unemployment in order to deter workers from asking for higher wages, and they think that that is going to prevent inflation. And they promote this approach by saying that they're actually helping workers by preventing this inflation from spiraling, and in a way kind of saving workers from themselves, which is quite bizarre, really. But that's the only weapon in their toolbox they have against inflation, and is deeply, deeply flawed. So we can't have that. So inflation needs to be under the control of the policymakers, of the elected government. So is employment. At the moment, is not, and it used to be, but not. So that's that. There was another point you made, Esther, and I can't remember what it was that I wanted to touch upon.
It was about the co-payments to the NHS and whether we can afford an NHS. So I said,
right, yes.
What are the real constraints? The constraints are the real ones, not the money ones, aren't they? That was.
So there are a couple of giveaways that we can afford the NHS, and one is the growing number of unemployed doctors going around. And the sole reason why they're not being employed, what they're struggling to find employment, is that the NHS trusts actually don't have the funds to hire them. That is the sole reason. But of course, if you understand MMT, if there's a resource available, you can afford to hire it. There's no reason why they shouldn't be hired. And the other thing that is a big giveaway is, I think Wes Streeting was talking about a while back about bringing in the private sector to help support the NHS. But why would the private sector be in any better position to support the NHS? If it's about shortages of resources, then surely if they're in the UK, unless you're planning to import these resources, then they are facing the same shortages as the NHS should be. They should be finding it difficult to find nurses or all these things the same as the NHS. Of course, that's not the case. Of course, if the private sector can do it, then so can the public sector. I believe that these what West Streeton was saying and the fact that doctors are not being employed is really about, as I said earlier, the state can create unemployment in order to make it easier for the private sectors to soak up these resources. And they are trying to build up the private provisioning of healthcare in the UK, making it easier for them to soak up these resources, these doctors, making it easier to hire doctors on the cheap, and to be able to provide these services. So in a nutshell, we can afford the NHS. So the government is not doing so, not because it doesn't believe it can afford it, but because it doesn't really believe in it. So we have really just a continuation of the Tory government on that regard. So I think personally, I think we should bring back the NHS into full public ownership. There's no reason for trust to be in debt to the government, for example. They almost treat them like individual businesses, right? And that is not the role. It is not the role of trust to be efficient in the way that businesses are efficient. There is an efficiency. Efficiency matters in the NHS, but is about a completely different set of rules. It's not about judging them in the way that you would judge the private sector. So yes, we don't need to charge people for it. I think that's just the next stage of privatization, really.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you, Patricia, for your talk this evening and also for answering my initial question. So we put in the chat, Patricia referred to Mosler and Mitchell. So I put links to their blogs in the chat, and also Richard Murphy, who writes a lot about this and about the NHS and the public sector. And somebody's posted a link to a video by Stephanie Kelton. So that's the 3 M's and the K. So please do have a look at those. I think that the more that we're literate about these issues and more progress we can make in having the debate, because as Patricia says, this debate hasn't really been had across the left yet. It would be really, really good if we get it started. And the more that we understand these issues, as have been really well explained by Patricia, the better chance we have of getting some traction. So I'm going now to go to the floor to see what some of our attendees want to say and want to ask. So we've got 2 people at the moment with their hands up, Alex and Robert. So we'll go to you, Alex, first.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Thanks very much for your talk, Patricia. Really enjoyed it. And I've been following you on the MMT podcast and elsewhere for a while. First thing I'd like to say is to ask whether you agree with me that while MMT folk have been reasonably effective in describing the kind of economics of MMT, sometimes not in the simplest possible terms, but I think people have done a reasonable job. And there are people in the UK like Richard Murphy, for example, who has done fairly well, I think, albeit to his limited audience. But what we, as in the MMT folk, have been absolutely appalling at is what you might call marketing MMT to the people who need to hear it, i.e. the politicians, the policy makers, the media and the general public, all of whom have a right and a responsibility to know about it and to put it into practice. So firstly, I'd like to ask whether you agree with that. Secondly, what ideas you have about how MMT can be publicized and popularized. And thirdly, whether you agree with me that an excellent way of doing it is for folk like you to take real policy examples, like whenever there's a budget, do an MMT budget, do a budget as if MMT mattered, to paraphrase Schumacher. And in the case of health, I would very much like to see you and others collaborating to do not the dreadful NHS plan that Streeting has recently announced, but an NHS 10-year plan as if MMT mattered.
First of all, Alex, yeah, thanks for that. I, well, as I said, I've been doing this for over a decade now, and I've seen a huge shift. At some point, sometimes it's been quite slow, and some days I woke up and thought, what am I doing? Like nothing's changing. And other days something would happen that would inspire me to keep going. Especially when I hear people saying, oh, I heard your podcast and I became really interested, and then I did a master's degree in economics as a result. And then so in the UK we had big obstacles from the onset, and the main one was that none of the main academics of MMT were really based here. And whereas MMT has been really successful at addressing the grassroots, which, by the way, no other economic theory has ever done this, started with grassroots. Um, it has faced limitations when talking to public officials and people higher up, because you start needing credentials. Then you start needing, no politician's gonna invite you over unless you have a master's or you have a PhD, and not just that, but from a reputable university. They need to, they're going to be held on account on the back of your expertise. So it's difficult to do that without those credentials. So what I've seen over the last 10 years is a growing influx of young folk who want to push MMT forward and want to take that next step. And they have started going into doing master's degree. I mean, I myself did a master's degree and then a PhD because of that, because we didn't have enough academics in the UK. And there is a wave coming soon of young academics who are eventually going to hit that. We hope it happens sooner rather than later. We also have people who are quite technical and in organizations like yours, who have spoken to MPs and who have spoken to left-wing MPs, some right-wing MPs, but not many, but even Labour Party. And a lot of the other obstacles is that people prefer to fail in familiar ways than succeed in unfamiliar ways very often. Because if a politician fails by doing what everybody else does, then he'll say, well, it's not just my fault, everybody else did the same. But if he fails taking the unorthodox route, then he's singled out as the idiot, the particularly wrong. So it's often a risk that politicians are not willing to take. Even Jeremy Corbyn, who I know he was at some point advised by Richard Murphy. And Richard Murphy's journey with MMT is kind of strange because he kind of arrived to it from his own end in a way, and then started reading Stephanie Kelton and all the others, and then realized actually we have a lot in common. And I know Jeremy Corbyn was influenced by Richard Murphy at the beginning with his People's QE, if you remember it. And at some point, they decide that this is too risky a strategy. I think there's a switchover. I think James Medway comes in exchange for Richard Murphy. And at some point, there was a real push from the left for credibility. But of course, credibility means the current narrative, and it means conceding that. And I don't think they realize how disastrous that was for what you could do. Because, and I know, there were many good things about that episode, but one of them was one key turning point to me was the fiscal rules that Corbyn introduced with the advice that was actually introduced by James Medway with his advice. And it was specifically designed to try to instill credibility. And of course, those are not exactly the same, but similar to the rules that now the Tories then adopted, that Rachel Reeves then adopted, and that are giving her so much trouble. And we warned Corbyn, McDonnell at the time that these fiscal rules would give them problems as well, because the economy is an unpredictable thing. You cannot really plan for when your next geopolitical event is going to happen, from when your next shortage. You may need to mobilize resources quickly. You know, when COVID happens, if Corbyn had won, he would have had to face COVID. And then his fiscal rule would have really limited him in doing so. Would have been, even if it hadn't limited him, he would have, it would have been politically hazardous. It would have given the right something to beat, stick to beat him with. Because you needed a fair amount of, a flexible fiscal budget to deal with COVID. You needed to take quick measures to prevent people from the huge unemployment that befell in the US and other things. So I don't like to think what might have happened if in that sense with the Corbyn government, but it is true that he seemed at some point influenced by this, but then it seemed too risky for them. Now things have changed, and it may be that, we tried that approach, that maybe this time he's willing to try something different. And I certainly see kind of a slow shift in politicians' willingness to listen. And I think it's because they're really hitting the end of the road with, Rachel Reeves doesn't even know how to get any growth. She doesn't understand why it's not happening magically. And I think a lot of people in Labour maybe are getting a bit concerned they're going to lose their seats. And they're really kind of willing to take a risk and to look at other perspectives. Fingers crossed.
That's a really, really encouraging response, Patricia. I've got Robert now with your hand up. Robert, over to you. Unmute yourself, please, Robert. Please unmute yourself. Let me see how to do that.
Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yeah, you can. Thank you.
Okay, so it is, of course, hugely releasing to think in terms of the fiat currency and being able to spend. It seems to me there are. I've been grappling with this, and I'm not really coming to a conclusion. A couple of things which MMT has to address more firmly, and that one is that having decided that you can spend when you want to, so with the NHS or whatever, and you're, Patricia, studying inflation, if we get into that situation where we're using the fiat currency, what the constraint is inflation. So what measures would be the policy for controlling inflation? Because there has to be an accompanying policy. Taxation, of course, might be one of the ways you do it, but when you think about the possible taxations that you might use, some of them might be not terribly good for working people. The other issue, which Stephanie Kelton talks about a lot, is the bond market. And in terms of the fear element that the right tends to promote, this is the thing they always come out with. Well, we've got to pay attention to the bond market, and whatever they say, we have to go along with. Now, of course, the point about that is, from MMT point of view, is that if necessary, we just convert those bonds to funds rather than having interest-bearing securities. But with a decentralized central bank, that I think presents some difficulties in the UK. Last of all, there is, I think, perhaps the odd mention in Stephanie Kelton's book of Keynesian theory. Nobody's ever says anything about Keynes, but when talking about MMT, but of course, this MMT is grafting something new.
Keynes.
Theory. So I'll be interested in your views on those.
Yeah, thank you. So Stephanie, inflation, how do you control it? What about bonds? And yeah, so your perspective on
it's quite a lot to say in 10 minutes.
Yeah.
My internet.
Well, inflation is a big topic, which is why I'm doing a PhD on it. Stephanie Kelton and the other MMT academics, grandees, say they have a very simple approach to inflation. First of all, a job guarantee is the foundation of inflation management in MMT. Is the only fundamental project policy prescription MMT does. All MMTers agree on we need a job guarantee, even though they may disagree on other things. And the reason being that if inflation is about resource management, then in order to maximize well-being, say, you need to ensure that you are linking your currency issuance to resource utilization as much as possible. And it's very difficult, and this is perhaps one point of difference with Keynes, is that it's very difficult to spend money into the economy and achieve full employment without specifically targeting those pockets of unemployment. So the job guarantee addresses that by basically, instead of demanding that workers accommodate to the employment market, it actually makes an employment market, a labor market that it accommodates to workers. So it meets workers, it creates employment where workers are, where they are, as they are, with whatever skills they have, and is about making sure that everybody who can contribute and has something to contribute can do so in their own way. And this means expanding and really redefining what a definition of employment is, by the way, because very often we see it in very narrow terms. Very often we think of employment as simply whatever makes the private sector a profit. And that's not the case. There's a lot of work activities out there that are very undervalued and that do not make a profit, and yet they're extremely important. And basically employment is everything that we decide employment is. And I'm not going to go into all the benefits of the job guarantee. That could be another lecture on its own right. But that's the foundation of inflation management, linking that spending to resource utilization. That will take care of a lot, but not of everything. And the rest of it is about when you do discretionary spending. And the job guarantee is what we call an automatic stabilizer. It goes up in times of recession, that spending, and that spending goes down when there's a boom in the private sector, as workers move in and out of the private sector employment. But apart from that, it's say the government has a big project and suddenly it wants to provide a new service that needs, say the government wants to ramp up house building, and it wants to I don't know, increase double the amount of house building there's doing at the moment. Where construction is a pretty tight market at the moment. There's a notorious lack of workers on that front. So you first need to start by looking at what resources you have available right now. If there is no availability in the construction sector in order to it's not physically capable of making more houses, then that money is not going to do anything. So first that's how we create fiscal space, first by making those resources available. And that may mean, taxation may be a way of achieving that. Taxation by means of reducing building of, for example, private sector offices, and then you make some construction workers available to build houses. Another way would be to invest in in training and education of more construction workers and things like that. So those are the different approaches. That will take you a long way into the kind of resource management takes you a long way into inflation management. Of course, when you have a lot of causes of inflation reasons, our geopolitical events come from outside. You have most notoriously, energy being an issue because we import so much of it, and in that sense, building resilience at home in terms of more energy production at home and changing the structure of our energy pricing and all this can actually help us manage those potential events that originate outside the country, makes us more resilient and less vulnerable to those types of events. So there is an aspect of being proactive here to give us the tools we need in future to be able to manage. And there are some goods. Energy is a very important industry, of course. That there are some industry which are what Isabella Weber in a recent paper called more systemically significant, because their price is built into the price of pretty much every other good in the economy. And so changes in those prices, the inflation is very sensitive to changes in prices of those particular industries. So I could say a lot more, but basically inflation management in an MMT economy is about resource management. And very often when I talk about this, a lot of people shriek because they go, oh, isn't that Soviet Russia, and you're basically doing central planning, and for some reason that's really scary term these days, but it's really countering that view that the market is all efficient in allocating resources, and really we need to be proactive in saying, okay, what kind of securities do we need, and where is it worth exchanging efficiency for resilience, and where is it, and what is really important to us, what kind of services do we want to secure for everybody, and understanding there are of course opportunity costs in every decision we make, right? And it opens so much opportunity. It opens, it changes completely the conversation as to that we should be having. I'm running out of time, so I'll go about what about bond markets? Who was it? The Liz Truss, the woman who lost the letters. She everybody now that becomes the scary story. Before it used to be Greece and the austerity in Greece, which was not relevant, but Liz Truss was actually quite educational of an episode. What happened was that there were some pension funds who had used a lot of bonds as collateral. So and the value of bonds is linked to the interest rate. So Liz Truss's policies were perceived by the market to create inflation, which were then interpreted as causing a higher interest rate in the future. But this is because of the policies of the central bank. And because of that, the bond markets then dropped in value, which meant that the collateral that these pension funds had dropped in value, which meant that they were margin called and they needed to put in more cash to maintain their positions. And of course, to do that, they had to sell bonds. But of course, then that exacerbated the drop in value of the bonds. And the central bank had to intervene, buying bonds, generate that demand in order to sustain the value of the bonds and make sure that the whole thing doesn't collapse. There's a whole chain of events there that we could question. One of them is the response function of the central bank was that the central bank has to increase interest rates, automatically. Arguably, is not an effective means of addressing inflation anyway. So let's drop it. The other one is, why were the pension funds so indebted to such a precarious extent that they were so vulnerable to shifts to changes in bonds? They should expect bonds to go up and down in value, and they should have prepared for it. So why were they allowed to get into that position in the first place? And then thirdly, the central bank, of course, it's its job to ensure stability. It's by intervening in this situation when all the other things have already happened. It's doing what it's meant to do, and yet in the media it's portrayed like a point of shame for the government that the central bank had to intervene. It's just doing what it is meant to be doing. But of course everybody likes to blame the whole thing on Liz's Truss policies, and I did not like her policies because most of them were about giving tax breaks to rich people anyway. But it really illustrates what the left may face under a budget that it doesn't even need to be inflationary. All it needs to do is need to be interpreted as inflationary by the markets. So the markets are not always rational, but there is volatility out there, and I'm sure if Corbyn came to power, they would panic and they would act even more irrationally. It's perfectly possible. But it does show you what you will have to face. Now, Liz Truss didn't have a very strong mandate. And even though the Bank of England is independent, in inverted commas, it can still be overridden by the central government if there is a strong reason to be doing so. And of course, the Parliament can change the mandate of the central bank and change the arrangements. Should it have parliamentary support to do that? Liz Truss' political position was very weak to begin with, even within her own party. And don't quote me on this because I don't have any proof for it, but I suspect just by looking at the statements that Andrew Bailey was giving out at the time, that there was a lot of politics behind his behavior and the things that he was saying in the media. I wouldn't be surprised if he was, well, he stated out loud that he didn't like Liz Truss's policies, but I wouldn't be surprised if he was actually working with somebody else within the Tory party to undermine Liz Truss and to embarrass Liz Truss in order to get rid of her. So there is all that. So that just highlights the importance of parliamentary support, basically. Sorry, have I run out of time?
No, we have run out of time, but basically, we're asking you to kind of deliver a whole economics degree or something in an hour.
It's a lot, yeah, sorry.
Well, we don't have any further questions, but I'm sure that everybody in the meeting will want to discuss this a lot. Thank you so much, Patricia, for giving up your evening. I mean, that's provided us with a lot of tools for understanding of the current issues. I mean, I'd finish by saying it's the role of the state to ensure that all of its citizens have the basic services that they need and to organise the economy, the real economy accordingly. That's the role of the state. So if we start with that, we completely turn upside down the whole kind of myth that you have to collect taxes and also in order to provide public services. And I think that's where we need to start from, including in our discussion about the NHS. So I think my takeaway is, well, how do we change the narrative? And Patricia's saying the narrative is already changing. There's a new cohort of young economists that are coming up through the ranks. Hopefully they're going to work for the Treasury as well, such that the debate will start to shift, and we can see that current monetary policy, it fails, doesn't it? It hasn't worked. It hasn't delivered growth. If growth is what we want. And when I went to when I was at the War on Want AGM a few weeks ago, James Medway was there as a panelist, and I didn't get around to my question, but he kept talking about growth and balanced budgets and so on. I really wanted to challenge him. Because of course that's what Corbyn took on board in the 2017 manifesto. So we need to be influencing that thinking as well. So yeah, thank you again, Patricia. Thank you everybody for coming here this evening. And Patricia, if you don't mind, we'll put your talk on our YouTube and we'll continue to discuss it. And we hope to hear from you again. Thank you very much. And thank you all for coming this evening.
Thank you. I had a really good time. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.